Have you ever heard of the incredible record of surviving 438 days lost at sea? Can you even imagine just how vast the Pacific Ocean is? It's truly massive. Picture starting on the northern coast of Chile and digging a hole straight through the earth, only to emerge on the other side and still find yourself in the Pacific, specifically in the South China Sea. This ocean covers about a third of the Earth's surface and is bigger than all the land on the planet combined, except for a few scattered islands. So, if you happen to get lost here, there's a good chance no one will ever find you. That's what makes the story of José Salvador Alvarenga and his miraculous rescue so fascinating. He holds a world record by accident that no one would ever want to break, surviving the longest time lost at sea. Somehow, he lived through 438 days adrift in the Pacific, a record unlikely to be beaten anytime soon. But how did he manage to survive such an ordeal? I'm sure that every time he watched this channel's videos, he liked and subscribed. So follow his lead and survive anything life throws at you. Now, let's dive into how his nightmare began in 2012. Alvarenga was an experienced fisherman working in Mexico. On November 17th, he and a guy named Ezequiel Cordoba set out together in their small fishing boat from the little coastal village of Costa Azul along Mexico's Pacific coast. They planned to be out for just a 30-hour fishing trip, so their boat was small and nowhere near prepared for the disaster that awaited them. It was basically an open canoe, no roof or cabin, about 7 meters long, with just a small motor and a cooler to store their fish. They knew a storm was coming, but fishermen in that part of Mexico could make enough money in one day to support themselves for a whole week. So they decided to take the risk and sailed about 120 kilometers offshore, starting their work at 1 a.m. The storm hit, and it threatened to sink their boat. Panicking, the two men cut their fishing lines, tossed all their gear and their entire catch overboard just to make the boat easier to handle. They were 6 hours away from shore, so they spent the night battling the storm, desperate to make it back by 7 a.m. The next morning, they were only 24 kilometers from the coast and could see the mountains in the distance. But then, disaster struck again. Bad luck on top of bad luck. Their motor died. With no oars or sails, the unusually strong winds started pushing their boat back out to sea. Thankfully, their onboard radio still worked, so they frantically reported their location to their boss, who promised to send help. But their radio battery quickly drained, leaving them in complete silence. Imagine the frustration they must have felt at that moment, knowing their only connection to the outside world was gone, watching the mountains on the horizon slowly fade away as the wind carried their tiny boat further into the vast ocean. Their boss organized search teams to look for them, but as their boat drifted deeper and deeper into the Pacific, the search became harder and harder. After just 5 days, they had to call off the rescue efforts, and that's when the real fight for survival began. The winds had already pushed them 450 kilometers off the coast before finally calming down. They were surrounded by nothing but ocean in every direction, and their boat was so small that they knew they probably wouldn't be spotted from the air. With no flares or other way to signal for help, their chances of survival seemed slim. They had no more supplies on board, so they were forced to catch fish or grab birds that landed on their boat with their bare hands for food. They found plastic bottles floating nearby and used them to collect rainwater to drink. But during long dry spells, they had to rely on drinking turtle blood they caught with their hands, or at times, their own urine. Now, imagine going day after day, month after month, in a tiny boat with only one other person to talk to, and the only ways to pass time were fishing or taking naps. It's easy to understand how someone could lose their mind in such conditions. And according to Alvarenga, that's exactly what happened to his friend. His companion Cordoba lost hope around 4 months into their isolation and became suicidal. He got sick from the raw food they were eating and eventually refused to eat at all, dying of starvation. Alvarenga was left completely alone in the middle of nowhere, with not another soul in sight as far as the horizon stretched, just a tiny speck in the vast Pacific Ocean. As you can see from this navigation map, the central Pacific where he was is one of the quietest places on Earth. Ships rarely pass through that area, but even so, he claims that one ship did. A cargo ship apparently sailed right past him, and 4 men on board saw him and waved, but they just kept going, not bothering to stop. Imagine the sheer frustration he must have felt at that moment, being lost for months, entirely alone, finally seeing rescue, and then watching as they ignored him and sailed away. 11 months passed, and Alvarenga had drifted about 8,000 kilometers across the ocean in his tiny boat. His clothes were in tatters, and all he had left was a sweatshirt to shield himself from the sun. But on January 30th, 2014, he finally spotted floating coconuts and birds circling near his boat. He knew land was close, and after drifting a little longer, he discovered an island that appeared uninhabited. It took him half a day just to drift close enough to the shore, and then he finally jumped out of his boat, leaving its confines for the first time in over a year. He swam to the shore and found a house. When he knocked, he made contact with the first other humans he had seen since leaving his village in Mexico 438 days earlier. After traveling almost 11,000 kilometers, to put that in perspective, imagine starting in a tiny boat in Lisbon, Portugal, and drifting less than a mile an hour until you've crossed enough distance to reach Oshima, Japan. Alvarenga eventually washed ashore on the atoll of Ebon, located at the southern tip of the Marshall Islands, one of the most remote places on the planet. If he had missed this tiny speck of land, his next likely destination would have been the Philippines, nearly 5,000 kilometers farther away. Given that it took him 438 days to cover about 11,000 kilometers, it would probably have taken him an additional 240 days to reach the Philippines. Luckily for him, he managed to land on this small point in the middle of the world's largest ocean, which ultimately saved his life. Later, he was taken back to his home in El Salvador, where he published a book about his ordeal. But his story didn't end there. He was sued by the family of his friend who died on the boat, with the accusation that he had likely eaten him. So the lesson here is that even if you survive over a year lost at sea, you might still end up facing a lawsuit for something you may or may not have done while out there.